So when you think about homesteading and history, who do you immediately think of? If you're like me, you think of the Ingalls family, which was Pa, Charles, and Ma, Carolyn, older sister Mary, younger sister Carrie, and the darling of the family, Laura. And Laura Ingalls Wilder took her adventures of growing up as a little girl in the woods and on the prairie and wrote a beautiful set of books about those experiences that we all still love today. And I don't know why I started reflecting on that this week. I know my granddaughters have all read those books. I know still they're very, very popular. And why is that? And I think it's because of the simplicity of it and um, the connections in the family and the mother and the father and the sisters and the family unit and how they all work together. And I really do think children are drawn to that. Where we think that children don't want to work, don't want to feel a part of things, I really think they enjoy being a part of things and helping. So it was probably because I didn't feel very good this week, and during those times I do a lot of reflection. But I wanted to delve in deeper to the Ingalls family, especially at Christmas time. They had some beautiful Christmas stories and Christmas specials and things like that based on the Ingalls family. But to put it in perspective, in 1874, one of my favorite Christmas stories from the Ingalls series was about their friend, Mr. Edwards. But in 1874, much like we have today, their world was stressful and chaotic too. So let's talk about what was going on in 1874. So the Ingalls family, they lived in the woods of Wisconsin during that time. They lived there. Laura was born there. She grew up there until she was about 2. Um, Her sister Mary had already been born. Little Carrie had not been born yet. When the family packed up and moved away and went west, like a lot of other homesteaders, they were going to live out west. They were going to homestead. They had heard that they could apply for land. It was up for anyone who wanted to settle on it. However, when the Ingalls family got there, they found out that that was not the case. Where they were directed to go was still Indian land. And the Indians weren't about to give it up at that time. So the Ingalls family had to go all the way back to Wisconsin. But they weren't alone there. The Ingalls grandparents were there, though that was Ma's family. They lived close by there in the woods, and they had other friends and other neighbors as well. One of their best friends was Mr. Edwards, who was a bachelor. He was a real kind of mountain man, tough guy. And he hadn't really won Ma Ingalls over. He was a little unrefined for her. um, but they liked him. He was a good friend of Mr. Ingalls. Okay, so during that time, they're living in the woods. They've created basically their own type of life there in the woods that relies on hunting and fishing, and they live in a cabin. They do have family close by, so they've kind of created their own little world. Laura's about 7 years old at this time in 1874. But in the rest of the United States, the war had only been over for maybe 7, 8 years. Okay, the Civil War. So there was still a lot of hard feelings between the North and the South over that. Still, we had a country that was in turmoil as far as uh, hard feelings and death. And we still had some ingrained beliefs about slavery and about minorities. So that was still very fresh in the United States at the time when Laura was about 7. During that time, too, The very first king from another country came to visit the United States and actually went to the White House and visited with Ulysses S. Grant, one of my favorite presidents. And the king was from Hawaii. That's interesting, isn't it? The very first king who came to the United States to visit as on a diplomatic mission was from Hawaii in 1874. In 1874, Jesse James was still alive and well, and he was doing a lot of train robberies during that time. And his most recent one during December of 1874, which is when this Christmas story was took place. Jesse James had robbed a train in Missouri. And another interesting story, you've heard the saying, never take candy from a stranger. Well, that happened in 1874. That was the very first kidnapping in the United States where a ransom was demanded. And that was for a little boy. And I believe his name was Charlie Ross, and he was 4 years old. And he and his brother had gone out to play several days earlier. And these two men in a carriage had asked them if they would like some candy, which they did take. And the two men tried to get them to ride along with them, which they did not. However, several days later, they enticed the boys with something they couldn't resist, which was fireworks. And they told the boys, Charlie was 4, and I believe his older brother was 6, and they'd been playing out in the yard. And the men said that if they would get in the carriage and ride with them to the store, they would buy them fireworks. So the older boy, the 6-year-old, went inside to buy fireworks that they had given him money. And when he came out, the carriage, the men, his brother was gone. A couple days after that, they demanded, I believe it was $20,000 for release of the little boy. The family lived in an affluent part of town in Philadelphia, but they weren't affluent. I think there'd been a bit of a stock market crash or some kind of financial crash not too long before that, so they were still living in their home, but they did not have the money to pay the ransom, so they went directly to the police. Little Charlie was never found. But not too long after that, a judge's house was broken into, but they caught the two men that had broke into the house. And one of the men was shot and died. The other man was very, very close to dying. And on his deathbed admitted that they were the two men that took the little boy, the little 4-year-old. But he died before telling them where the little boy was. The man's wife confirmed it, but she did not have any idea where the little boy was either. And so later on in history, you hear that a lot of people came forward and said that it was them, that they were Charlie, but they weren't. DNA has been able to prove that several times. Once that became a scientific tool that we could use. A very sad story, but you've heard the saying, and so it was not heaven on earth in 1874 when the Ingles family was alive. There was still a lot going on. But Mr. and Mrs. Ingles had been able to create for their children a peaceful, loving home where the kids joined in with the work, but they also had time for play, and they were taught behaviors that were acceptable. They were taught respectful behavior to their elders. They were taught about the gospel of Christ. They were Christians. And it's something that still resonates with people today. So, one of my favorite stories I told you was about Mr. Edwards. And so, during this December 1874 Christmas, the weather was horrible and they had had snow and snow and snow. They had also had where the snow would melt and the water would rise, the creeks and things like that. So it was a lot of flooding. Mr. Ingles, they Christmases weren't extravagant then like we have now, but they did get a few small things. And he had planned on going to town on Christmas Eve and getting the girls a few things. He wasn't able to go because the water, the creeks and things like that were close to their home had risen. Couldn't get across it safely. Started snowing again, and Laura even talks about they couldn't hardly open the front door, and when they did finally get it open, the sheet of snow was up above their heads. So Christmas was looking rather bleak for the Ingles family that year. But an amazing thing happened. And later in the evening, when they were all looking at the fire, the house was very quiet. They were all, Mom and Pa were really pretty sad. They didn't have anything to give the kids. The next day, they heard a commotion outside and beating at the door. And so Pa opened the door, and Mr. Edwards was yelling, we got to get the snow away from the door because I've got some things for you. I ran into Santa Claus. So somehow they dug out the door, and Mr. Edwards was able to come in soaked from head to toe. But he told this amazing story of how he ran into Santa Claus, and Santa Claus was having the same trouble as Pa was, and he couldn't cross rivers, he couldn't cross creeks, but he saw Mr. Edwards and he asked if he would help out delivering packages. So the girls were just amazed, and Ma and Pa just couldn't believe that he had come across the water when it was so dangerous. And actually, he carried their presents up on his head and waded through the water one step at a time just to make sure that the Ingles children had a Christmas. And so I wanted to read you this little excerpt from Little House in the Big Woods. It's one of my favorite stories about that Christmas with Mr. Edwards. Something was shining bright in the top of Laura's stocking. She squealed and jumped out of bed. So did Mary, but Laura beat her to the fireplace. And the shining thing was glittering. It was a new tin cup. Mary had one exactly like it. These new tin cups were their very own. Now they each had a tin cup to drink out of. Laura jumped up and shouted and laughed, but Mary stood very still and looked with shining eyes at her own tin cup. Then they plunged their hands into their stockings again, and they pulled out 2 long sticks of candy. It was peppermint candy, striped red and white. They looked and looked at that beautiful candy, and Laura licked her stick, just one lick. And Mary was not so greedy. She didn't even take one lick of her stick. Those stockings weren't empty yet. Mary and Laura pulled out 2 packages, and then they unwrapped them. Each found a little heart-shaped cake. Over their delicate brown tops was sprinkled white sugar. The sparkling grains lay in drifts of snow. The cakes were too pretty to eat. Mary and Laura just looked at them. But at last, Laura turned hers over, and she nibbled a tiny nibble from underneath where it would not show. And the inside of that little cake was white. It had been made from pure white flour and sweetened with white sugar. Laura and Mary would have never, ever looked in their stockings again. The cups, the cakes, and the candy were almost too much. They were too happy to speak. But Ma asked, "Are you sure that the stockings are empty?" Then they put their arms deep inside their stockings, and in each toe of the stocking was a shiny, bright new penny. They had never even thought of having a penny. Thinking of having a whole penny of your very own. Think of having a cup, a cake, a stick of candy, and a penny. There had never been such a Christmas. I just love that story. So Mr. Edwards brings them each a cup, each a long peppermint piece of candy. And Ma Ingalls had managed to make them each a beautiful little heart-shaped cake. And I'm not sure who gave them the penny, but such meager gifts in the way we think today brought them such joy. And if you think about it, we go out to eat all the time. Little things. You go to a vending machine. If you need something from the store, you go get it. Back then, those things were special. It's very special occasions and events you didn't have every day. And a lot of the things went with the seasons. So in a lot of her books, she talks about the joy and excitement of maple syrup. Well, that's because they only got that during the times of the year where the trees were producing the syrup. And the whole family, grandmas, grandpas, aunts, uncles, they all worked to make maple syrup out of the sap that was coming from the trees. So a lot of their life was centered around the seasons, which is how, if you're trying to start a homestead and you're trying to cut back on expenses, that's a good thing to think about. You want to look at the store and the food that's seasonal, what you can plant with the seasons, things that are on sale, where you can get things that you can't afford to pay full price for, so you can make your life sort of seasonal too. And that's a good way to think of it. I also like how the wonder of it all, the wonder of the whole story, the amazement that Mr. Edwards was able to make it through the blizzard, the sweet gesture that he did to make sure that the girls had a Christmas, but he also did that for his adult friends, Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls, because he loved them too. So remember your friends this Christmas, and when you do, think about Mr. Edwards. And then they talk later on in the story about the evening as it went on. And then Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards sat by the fire, and they talked about Christmas times past in Tennessee and up north in the big woods. But Mary and Laura looked at their beautiful cakes and played with their pennies and drank water out of their beautiful shiny tin cups. So you guys, they made that candy last for a week. And they didn't want to eat their cakes, and they played with their pennies, and they were just so happy with what they had. And so that's something we don't want to ever forget, is no matter how big, no matter how small the gift that someone gives you or that you're able to give to someone else this holiday season, it really is the thought that counts. And homemade gifts are the best too. So I hope you'll stay with me, because I am going to make some of those little heart cakes. I thought that was so beautiful in the story, so I'm going to make some for my family. And I hope you'll stay with me, and I hope you're all having a wonderful holiday season so far. I also want to give my condolences. I live here in the Midwest. We were hit by, we had really, really strong winds last night, but the areas of Paducah, Kentucky, and Edwardsville, Illinois, Arkansas, some parts of Tennessee, were really hit by a swath of tornadoes. A lot of people have lost their lives, and others are without their homes, without their Christmas, without their presents, and it's just devastating. It's devastating no matter when, but this time of year it makes it even more devastating. So let's be really grateful for the gifts that we get. Let's be really grateful for the things that we have, and let's help each other through this holiday season and the upcoming year. I hope you guys will join me next time. Have a great week.